Watchers in the Fourth Dimension.
Good evening, everyone, to our fourth consecutive Halloween horror episode of the Watchers in the Fourth Dimension. I'm your Crypt Keeper, Riley.
I'm Diana.
I'm Julie.
And I'm Anthony.
This year, our double feature starts off with the titillating The Vampire Lovers from 1970, and of course we must fit in another Amicus Production horror anthology film with 1965's Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. Our musical intro again was from George C. Music on YouTube, who creates tons of variations of the Doctor Who theme, so make sure to check that channel out. For those unfamiliar, each year we select 2 horror films with a major Who connection, usually starring one of the actors that have portrayed the Doctor, and we'll go through each film one by one with questions provided by me to the rest of the Watchers gang. For this year, our Who connections are as follows. In The Vampire Lovers, Ingrid Pitt was from The Time Monster. Kate O'Mara was from The Mark of the Rani and The Time of the Rani. And of course, Peter Cushing from those Doctor Who Amicus films. Now, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors is loaded with Who connections. Once again, we have our good friend Peter Cushing. We have Edward Underdown from the Werewolf Story, who played Zastor in the Doctor Who television story Meglos, which we have not gotten to, of course. Anne Bell from the Creeping Vine story was in the following Big Finish stories: 1,000 Tiny Wings, Night of the Stormcrow, and 529. Roy Castle was from Peter Cushing's Doctor Who and the Daleks. He was in the Voodoo story. And of course, the celestial toymaker himself, Michael Gough, was in the Disembodied Hand story, as well as Isla Blair, who played Isabella Fitzwilliam in the Doctor Who television story The King's Demons. She also voiced several characters for Big Finish productions. And Judy Cornwell was also in the Disembodied Hand story. She played Maddie in the Doctor Who television story Paradise Towers. And, I'm telling you, there's a lot. Max Adrian from the Vampire story was King Priam from The Mythmakers.
Yeah.
Wow.
Also, it keeps going. The writer, Milton Subotsky, produced and wrote the Cushing Dalek movies. And Max Rosenberg, a producer on Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, also produced those movies. Now that we have covered all the Doctor Who connections that I have found, at least until Anthony will reveal some later that I missed, I'm sure, let's go into The Vampire Lovers. The Vampire Lovers came out in 1970 with the intention of taking advantage of a more relaxed censorship environment. It is loosely based on the 1872 novella Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. I am not French, so please do not kill me for that pronunciation. And with the Hammer Horror Universe, it is the first film in the Karnstein trilogy, which is, I quote, a series of vampire films produced by Hammer Films, which were notable for their daring lesbian storylines. The other 2 films of the series are Lust for a Vampire of 1971 and Twins of Evil in that same year. The film was directed by Roy Ward Baker and written by Tudor Gates. Cinematography by Moray Grant, edited by James Needs, and music by Harry Robertson. Now, the chief censor of the British Board of Film Censors warned this production that the script had depictions of lesbianism, and so that may not get through. In response, Hammer argued that the lesbianism wasn't added by them, it was just in the original novella. And apparently, that worked.
Yeah.
So the budget was only £165,000, and unfortunately I can't find any information as to what the box office was. Back then the critical reviews were, and now were, lightly positive, stating that, and I love this, it pushes the bloodshed and bosoms formula. Now, before we dive in, I have to add this anecdote that came up when I was researching it. Peter Cushing's biography contained a story in which he says that while filming the scene in which Carmilla attacks Madame Perraudot, Ingrid Pitt's fangs kept falling out of her mouth and dropping into Kate O'Mara's cleavage, which would apparently prompt uncontrollable laughter from both of them. So eventually, Pitt just grabbed some chewing gum from the mouth of one of the crew members and used it to secure the fangs to complete the scene. So,
wow.
Yeah. As the poster for The Vampire Lovers says, do we dare taste the deadly passion of the blood nymphs?
Oh, God.
Blood nymphs.
Yes. Okay, first question. Does The Vampire Lovers pass the Bechdel test?
Yes, and I also love when Ingrid Pitt's character is just like, oh, this is a terrible romance story.
Yes. What trash.
Wonderful.
But yeah, it does.
So yes, it does.
Yeah.
I don't know what else there is to say.
I thought about it while I was watching it, and I was shocked in the moments where, like, this is somehow passing the Bechdel test? What?
It's weird in that it does, but equally it's incredibly objectifying at the
100%.
same time.
Which kind of leads into, off of that same question, and this isn't moving forward, let's keep talking about this, is how do you feel about how the film handles lesbianism?
So a couple things. Well, one, and then this is still a little on the Bechdel test. It's not something that's very useful anymore just because it's one facet of an entire storyline. But I digress. A lot of the lesbianism, I don't want to say it's tacked on, but what I found very interesting is when Carmilla or Marcilla, whichever name you want her to go by, when she chooses to seem like to actually like one of these ladies, and when she's just like, yeah, it's just another one.
Mm-hmm.
That confused me a little bit, just from the perspective of it was kind of a little all over the place. And maybe that somewhat fits because she's picked one because that's the one that she likes, although she almost had the two. But, what are we going to do?
What was interesting to me about it is, outside, of course, of the exploitative element, it doesn't necessarily paint it as completely sinful or forbidden. I mean, they make it look salacious, but it at times kind of tries to make it feel a bit romantic, which I was kind of impressed by because I thought we were going to have maybe a stronger puritanical message here.
I definitely agree. That was kind of what caught my interest in it. Was I was definitely going in expecting full lesbian succubus sexploitation kind of a film, and for it to not be villainizing the sexual aspects, just the murderous ones, I thought was actually really interesting and progressive, especially for the era. I didn't think that it actually negatively portrayed lesbianism at all. They didn't paint it with any of a different brush than when she seduced the male butler.
Yeah, Renton. Mm-hmm.
It's funny that Diana brings up the seduction of Renton, because that one to me felt a bit dirtier, almost. That one felt a bit more opportunistic and transactional, I guess. Whereas her seduction of, I guess, Laura and then Emma seemed a lot more romantic. And then Mademoiselle Peridot obviously was absolutely besotted by her as well.
Oh, yeah.
It is funny. You got a movie in 1970 that manages to make the heterosexual relationship feel kind of sleazier than the lesbian ones, which is not what you would expect for a film of that time.
What I found interesting too was there's a bit of classism going on, though, because she goes to seduce all of the ladies, the actual from proper families.
Right. And
she just goes and outright kills the one lady in the woods and the maid and all these others. And I just found that interesting that she had standards, I suppose.
That's a really good point. That went right past my head, but you're absolutely right. She is kind of, one could say having standards, one could say snobby. It depends on which way you want to look at it. So,
upwardly mobile, socially.
Yeah. On a kind of a branch off of this, we've talked about the themes of lesbianism. We've talked about the Bechdel tests. Let's confront the gratuitous nudity. Now, as mentioned in the intro, this film was intended to take advantage of a relaxed censorship environment. And this is a far cry for those that remember it when we covered it before the Dracula film from 1958 that Hammer did, where at that point, they almost had to push the envelope just to get blood on the screen. So how do we feel about the use of nudity? Is it straight exploitative? Do you think that at points it was needed? What do you think?
I was wondering while I was watching this, was this intentionally designed to, because there's that line in film of I'm going to push the buttons. And then there's that line of I'm going to be intentionally sexploitative and premiere for that late night audience where it's going to be in theaters in a late night. And so I felt that distinction was kind of important, because if it's a sexploitative film, I would say it's pretty mild. It's not actually all that gratuitous. If this was in theaters at like 7 p.m., like absolutely, yeah, because it was a lot of boobies.
It was. What was interesting sometimes is, in some cases, yes, you might call it gratuitous, but the first one that you really notice when the doctor comes in and is going to listen to her heartbeat, and it's so casual.
So unnecessary. Yeah.
It's unnecessary, but also at the same time, it's like, well, that is actually, a doctor might have to do that when he's looking at a patient. So it's one of those very interesting things where I'm just like, this feels a little weird, and I'm not sure which side of the fence I go on.
Now, off of that, I would like to give a slight defense to that, because I was going into it and I had that same feeling about that scene as well. But now I don't know if this is a strong defense, but I will play the devil's advocate here. The doctor does that. And yeah, it seems unnecessary, but it does provide them the reveal of where the bite marks were and explain to them, oh, this is a vampire. She isn't just dying of anemia.
Well, and then you can talk about whether it's exploitative or not, that she only on the girls tends to bite their boobies.
Well, but see, maybe she's being smart because she knows it's such an uptight, repressive society that if she does it there, she can hide the bites better.
Well, that's not a good place to draw blood. That's a lot of fat.
Yeah, of course.
That's not a good. That's not
good point.
That's not
good
a good
point.
bite spot, Miss Vampire.
Diana, how dare you be logical on this? How dare you?
Well, it was interesting because I actually, when I first was like, here comes the view of the bits, was honestly with the very first vampire, and she's wearing that like really loose chiffon, like Regency era dress. And I had the moment of like, okay, so this is kind of like where we're going. But at the same time, I was also excited because in the Regency era, people walked around wearing those chiffon see-through dresses. And so it's weirdly historically accurate. Maybe not from the time she died, but from the time she's hanging out in. And those kinds of outfits are never really seen on screen because they are scandalous. And so I was kind of excited to see it because they're trying to push those buttons.
I think one thing that's interesting is you look at Hammer's other output from roughly the same time. This was the same year as Scars of Dracula, which I know we did, I think, a couple of years ago at this point. Taste the Blood of Dracula was the same year as I think there was a Frankenstein movie. This was unusual in the amount of nudity for Hammer. So I do wonder if that might have been a little unexpected for the audience, because by this point, Hammer does have a reputation with its horror movies. So it is something different. Because of that, in comparison to their other output, it does feel a little exploitative to me. It does feel a little gratuitous just in comparison with everything else they're doing.
Before we move on to the next question, Diana brought up the opening scene, which feels kind of distant from the rest of the film and only gets referred back to right in the third act. But I could not let that pass because I think that the use of the studio set, the use of mist, the use of the fabrics, the slow motion, I think that was absolutely gorgeous, that beginning.
I have to say, Riley, I agree in that it's gorgeous. What I dislike wholeheartedly is the amount of voiceover that was used. I'm like, can you just stop talking and stop giving me this is how you kill vampires so I can just like watch what's happening, please? That would be great.
They're showing it. You don't have to say it.
I did think that intro was quite corny as well. I mean, particularly the decapitation, where it's so very clearly a prosthetic.
Wow. Are you kidding? Yeah. I rewound that and watched that several times. But I'm a big fan of that kind of like bad physical effects.
Right. Well, we have a mysterious male vampire that on horseback, smiling from a distance, wearing a pilgrim hat that pops up throughout the film. But really, he is not the villain. Ingrid Pitt as Carmilla is the villain. Oh, wait, maybe she's not. Do you think she was actually falling in love with any of these women? Or just maybe at least falling in lust with them? Or was this just all a means to get a meal?
I definitely feel like she was in love with Emma, the second one. Maybe Laura seemed like a lay and a meal. Emma seemed a bit more of an actual romance.
I would agree with that aspect of it. I do think that Emma was the only one that I could actually see a true romance with. As to whether or not villain or not, it's been a while since I've read Carmilla, so I could not remember all the ins and outs of the original story. But with this random dude off there in the distance, I was at one point apparently expecting there to be a harem somewhere where there's a collection of the women that Carmilla has been going through, or just briefly. And then I was like, that seems too weird. So I don't know that I see her as a villain or not, but why in the world did we have that man?
I think he's our connection to the 2 other films upcoming in the Karnstein trilogy. It's been a while since I've seen them, so I cannot confirm, but I believe that is the case.
Throughout the whole thing, I was confused the whole time, and then realized in the very last 5 minutes that I actually understood the whole thing the whole time, which was very confusing. Especially because they have Mr. Top Hat vampire dude who has a face covered in rice flour, and everybody's like, look at that normal human. Like, that was so weird. That man is clearly dead.
Regular human pilgrim.
Yeah. But there was also that other lady vampire, the mama or the like liaison for Carmilla.
Yeah.
And she kind of reminded me of like a harem leader, almost like when you get a nice little coven of vampires and they're led by like the matriarchal female vampire. She kind of gave me those vibes. So I thought, while Carmilla is not like necessarily like a great person vampire thing, she's taking orders from somewhere. She's being told, hey, this is the next target, or else probably. So I didn't think that she was necessarily the villain. I think that Top Hat Man and his side piece are probably the main villains. But that Carmilla's not innocent. She didn't strike me as like the main villain. It was the shady people up there on the hill.
I think I agree with that. It certainly seems to be a group operation. I almost saw them as scam artists, right? They're almost planning a little bit of a heist, except for instead of a heist, it's vampirism.
The first 2/3 of this film are dominated by the female characters. The men are either sidelined or completely oblivious to what's going on. That is until Renton the butler shows up. And we've already discussed him a little bit, but when Renton shows up, this is where the film turns more into a basic vampire film, where we have a third act of male vampire hunters coming together to stop evil. Now, did you find this ending satisfactory, or do you think based off of the first 2/3 of the film, the ending should have gone completely differently, or slightly differently?
First off, Emma had no hope at all. So if you're expecting Emma to all of a sudden figure out that she's being slowly killed, that was never going to happen. I promise you that. The thing that I at least appreciate is the fact that I love getting to see Peter Cushing make the killing blow. Excellent. Right. Perfect. The fact that he also double tapped it and was like, stabbing it is not enough. I'm going to cut her head off. Brilliant. I thought that one little aspect was great. So I forgive maybe just bringing all the men in, because for once there's a smart man that says, let's make sure this bitch is dead. Love it.
I do think if this was to be remade now, they would have had Emma's female friends club together and be the ones to do the vampire hunting and kill Carmilla or Mircalla or Marcilla. Pick one. There's definitely been a lot of change in how movies are made since 1970, and I would quite like to see that version of this. Could be fun.
I thought it was okay for the guys to all come in at the end because of standards of the time and of the era that story's taking place in. Yeah. Especially because I would say that a pretty significant portion of the reason that they can be successful is because of that housemaid sticking to her guns and being like, nah, man, I'm not taking out the flowers. I was told I'm not supposed to take out the flowers, and you're really scary and really pretty, and you're not giving me any attention, so I'm not going to move the flowers. But, you know, like, she was just a serving girl. They were surrounded by a bunch of very wealthy people, and she could have crumbled, and she didn't. And at any point, she never really came off as scared or screamy or anything. So I think the inclusion of her makes it all that much more acceptable.
MVP.
Yeah, definitely.
Unlike Renton, who all it takes is a seduction, and he's like, let me get rid of all these flowers.
God, he went from you're scary to like, let's go.
In all fairness, it is Ingrid Pitt.
Well, for sure. There were aspects of it that made me wonder if they didn't lean into, I don't know what aspects of vampirism have been added to the culture throughout time, but I don't know if then vampires could glamour people. Oh,
the thrall.
Yeah.
Yes, we've had that because, let's be fair, Christopher Lee was always having that whenever he played Dracula. So I think that's always been a part of it. And I think that was even part of the books, if I recall correctly. And there was definitely some of that, but it wasn't as obvious as I've seen it in other vampire films.
Yeah, that's what I thought, given Kate O'Mara, who I will from now on just refer to as the Ronnie. She gave me immediate glamour vibes. And that was where I didn't think that she was ever actually in love, because it happened so intensely and so quickly. And that fierce intensity that did not affect Emma. There wasn't that fierce, oh my God, I'm obsessed with you, that like maybe she could glamour, but not everybody. And like, what was that? Because it happened to her and it happened to Mr. Butler Man.
See, I think that is probably something they were playing the line with. Is it glamour or is it lesbianism? Mm-hmm. That's basically the question. And I keep thinking about the scene where Emma gets thrown down on the bed and Marcilla is making her move, and the acting there by Emma, her eyes go gigantic, and I can't figure out, are her eyes getting really, really big because she's being mesmerized, or is she being shocked that this woman is trying to have sex with her? That's the question.
Realizing that she kind of likes it, even though it's socially taboo.
So you don't really know. I guess that may be what they were trying to play with.
You can't tell with Emma's face ever, because she always kind of had that weird open-eyed animatronic face the whole time. Hands down the scariest part of the film.
Well, overall, what did we think of The Vampire Lovers? Is this going to be a future go-to Halloween classic for you?
Absolutely.
All right.
No,
a positive review.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm never going to watch it again. But
okay.
But I will acknowledge that my last notes that I wrote while I watched this was, considering that I didn't realize I understood what was happening until the last 5 minutes, and I didn't think I liked it as I was watching it, I ended it and I was like, oh, that was actually pretty good. I didn't hate that. I enjoyed that hour and a half. That was nice.
I want to add one little tidbit because it has absolutely nothing to do with the plot whatsoever. One of the horses in that was named Jupiter, and I thought that was wonderful. So good job, Jupiter. Love you. I don't know that I would go out of my way necessarily to watch it again, but if someone were to say, hey, I kind of want to watch this, I would watch it again.
Yeah, I think I'd fall in the same camp.
I don't know if I would watch it again or make an active choice to watch it again if it was on in the background, sure. I am curious about the sequels, though.
Oh, the continuation in the trilogy?
Yeah.
I have not seen those films in a very long time, so my mind is completely erased in regards to them. I do know the Twins of Evil literally do have twins in them. Of the human sibling type, not the other type. But they probably have that too.
Well, I was just going to say, if I can learn what the deal is with Mr. Top Hat Dude, then maybe.
That's the promise of the future. They lure you into the other films with Top Hat Dude.
It did seem a little weird to me to have a vampire Hammer movie that has Peter Cushing but no Christopher Lee.
Yeah. But in its defense, The Vampire Lovers did have a wonderful guest starring role by Gustav the Cat.
Oh, Gustav.
Yeah, I don't know if you noticed, but at the end of this scene, he was blepping.
I did notice that.
Yeah. It was fantastic. Anyway, that is a wrap on The Vampire Lovers. Now it is time for an intermission for refreshments.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Delicious things to eat.
The popcorn can't be beat. The sparkling drinks are just dandy. The chocolate bars and the candy. So let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Welcome back. Dr. Terror's House of Horrors is a 1965 film from Amicus directed by Freddie Francis, who directed several British horror films of the time, but is more well known as an Oscar-winning cinematographer. But for Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, this time the cinematographer was Alan Hume. The film was edited by Thelma Connell, and the music was by Elizabeth Lightens. As stated previously, this was written by Milton Subotsky. Now, this was Amicus Production's first ever horror anthology film, and it came out the same year as their Doctor Who and the Daleks film. The goal of this film was to try to hit the heights set by one of the greatest horror films of all time, the British horror anthology film from 1945, Dead of Night. If you haven't seen it, please do. It is amazing. The budget for this film was £105,000, and it is notable for having several familiar actors. Of course, Christopher Lee, Bernard Lee of James Bond fame, and, rest in peace, just recently, Donald Sutherland. Now, the critics were generally favorable, and over time they called this anthology film underrated. So, let's see what Dr. Shrek's tarot cards say about our future.
I know why we covered this now. Mr. Shrek.
Yes, that's Dr. Shrek for the rest of this podcast. We have 5 stories, so I'm only going to throw out one question for each one, so we won't be here all night. Now, feel free to provide whatever thoughts you have on the story, as we will not be going back. So let's jump right in. The first story is that classic tale of returning back to your old family home in Scotland, only to be killed by a werewolf.
Classic.
My question is this. Is Scottish real estate worth that risk?
I mean, have you been to the Highlands?
I love the Highlands. Yes. It's worth the risk. I would go.
Especially depending on how much you're paying for the estate.
It's a family estate, so you shouldn't be paying anything.
Except he paid with his life.
Well, and he was coming back to do the renovations.
Remodeling.
That lady had bought it from him. It came fully furnished. Sounds like a plan. Let's do it.
This one is really the most traditional of the 5. It's got the most gothic scenery and a classic horror character or monster with a werewolf. What do we think about this one in general, outside of course, wanting to move to Scotland?
One thing that was interesting, and I think it was a little bit done on purpose. So at the very end, when he goes to confront Mrs. Biddulph, however.
Yeah, I can't remember how they pronounce it, like Biddulph or something like that.
Something. So when he goes to confront her and he's going to tell her about what's going on, and he's up in her room, it first looked like a dog attacked. Yeah. And I was like, this is very disappointing. But I actually think it was a dog that attacked, because obviously it turns out that she's the werewolf. So I think they did that as a misdirect. But I'm like, why didn't you introduce a dog earlier so that at least I know why there was a dog? That was just the weirdest thing to me. But yeah.
I didn't love this one.
You didn't love it?
No.
We did get the very ever popular white shirt that's unbuttoned so we could see a man's chest.
Is that your highlight, Julie?
In the Highlands.
There you go. There you go.
Too well.
It only works because he's in the Highlands.
Julie, going back to your point about the appearance, when he comes across the grave, it looks more like that grave is not a cutout of a werewolf. It looks more like a lion. I don't know what they were going with their design with that, but maybe that's what Scottish werewolves look like. Who knows?
Yeah, I thought it was like a basic story. I think it's a good choice for the first story because it really sets up that idea that is Dr. Terrible a con man? Is he a charlatan? Is he just scaring them? Especially with the aspect of the supernatural in it. It lets the viewer not necessarily buy into the fact that Dr. Terrible is anything other than a weird dude on a train.
Right. Well, let's jump into story number 2, and that is The Creeping Vine. This is where it takes the Ministry of Defense and several scientists a couple of days to figure out that, you know what, fire may be a possible solution to plant overgrowth. This one feels a lot like a throwback to the sci-fi horror of the 1950s, where we have men in white coats talking about how to stop giant radioactive bugs or aliens. And I have to be honest about this one. I didn't care for this one at all. What are everyone else's opinions about this one in general?
Well, first off, the second that they couldn't break a vine with the shears, I would have GTFO'd out of there.
Yeah.
And 2, they killed a dog.
They killed the dog.
I'm
Poor
out.
Rusty, the bestest boy.
Out.
This point where I was questioning, like, why is everyone just casually accepting living plants? I mean, I guess plants are living, but
Murderous
plant. Like, there was never this moment, even with the werewolf story, never this moment of like, oh my God, this is crazy. There was no shock that all of a sudden plants had murderous intent. It was like, oh, well, okay, I guess plants trying to kill us.
About time, right?
Right, yeah.
10 or so years before Doctor Who did the Crinoid.
Yeah, there we go. This is their inspiration. And another issue with this story seems to be that one could argue it doesn't really have a proper resolution.
No.
We see that the vine eventually learns how to put out a small fire, We don't know how it would handle a flamethrower. We don't know what happens with the scientists who left. We don't know what happens with our family that's stuck in the home. Is it just affecting their home or is it affecting the world? We don't really know.
Killer kudzu.
It's not particularly satisfying.
It definitely leaves a lot to be desired. But that all changes with story number 3. Sometimes horror anthologies will try to mix in a story with comedy, and this is what we have here with the story of a jazz musician stealing sacred music from a voodoo ceremony from the West Indies. Obviously, the lesson here is that plagiarism is bad. When I got to this one, I was very worried that this story would be incredibly racially insensitive. Maybe I set my expectations way too low, but I don't think this one was that bad. How do you guys feel about it?
I was super impressed because the second they were like, we're taking, Biff to the West Indies, I was like, oh, Biff is never a good time. Like, never.
First off,
ever.
the name Biff.
Right? It's literally slang for you messed up. You biffed it. And Biff biffed it hard. But that being said, we joke that it's a lesson on don't plagiarize. I really took it. They were telling him this is a religious thing. This is a sacred thing. It was fully appropriation. Like, I want to monetize it. I'll cut you in. And I thought it was really interesting to do it that way. And was the depiction of the West Indians necessarily great? Left some to be desired. But of the era and what they were talking about, I actually thought it was really decent.
Wasn't nearly as racist as it could have been.
This one was probably the most satisfying for me because the second Biff got on the train, I hated him. And so when I get to the end and he dies, passes out, whatever it happened to him, died of being terrified so much, my soul just eased a little bit there because he was terrible and I hated him. And I'm glad he's gone.
That's the movie Ian, I will have you know, Julie.
That has nothing to do with anything. In this one, his name was Biff, and he was a douchebag.
I knew that he had to die the second I saw that he had a zebra-striped couch.
Questionable taste. We sentence you to death.
Yep.
See, this hits on a very classic bit that comes up often in these horror anthologies. Sometimes they're morality tales. Sometimes they're a combination morality tale / man, this person is just an annoying asshole. I want to see them get killed.
Absolutely.
Let's move on. The 4th story is a classic trope in horror, the disembodied hand. Now, this one takes hounding somebody to a whole new level. Now, here's my question. Did Michael Gough's character go too far? Was the initial trick with the chimpanzee enough? Or did he have to keep following Christopher Lee around all over the place, reminding him of it?
Yeah, I definitely think he took it too far.
At that point, you kind of understand why Christopher Lee decided to run him over.
First off, I was surprised that Christopher Lee wasn't the vampire. Shouldn't have been surprised. But also the fact that I got Christopher Lee versus Michael Gough. Okay, maybe Michael Gough deserved it a little bit, but just to see the two of them going back and forth really made it for me. That was beautiful and glorious. I love the two of them.
I didn't look into any of this before I started watching it because it's not my typical genre, and so I wanted to go into it blind. And I knew, because my nerd background is firmly rooted in Lord of the Rings, that Christopher Lee was a horror guy, and that was really where he made his name and everything, but I was not expecting him to be in this film. And so when he showed up, you know what? Gough might have gone too far by following him around, but follow Christopher Lee around. Are you kidding? If I knew where he was getting coffee, I'd be like, yo, what's up? Yes, follow Christopher Lee around. Absolutely. He is a god. But other than that, stalking is probably not appropriate. So too is hitting someone with your car.
I do want to call out disembodied hands as one of my childhood recurring nightmares.
Oh, God.
Oh, that's fun.
I hope I didn't give you a nightmare then.
No. Again, hasn't happened since I was about 8 years old, but it was like, oh yeah, I remember having bad dreams about this.
Whereas the first thing I remember with disembodied hand, obviously other than Thing, it was definitely the movie with Seth Green. With the hand that went around
Idle
killing
Hands.
People. Yes.
God, I can't believe I remember that movie. Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. That was actually not bad.
I loved that movie when I was younger. So yes, Anthony, I did not think that they were scary. I thought it was fun.
I liked this one because it had a seam running up the side from the casting said hand,
right.
And that made me giggle.
I thought it was refreshing because Christopher Lee, as we had covered before, when he would do Hammer films, he got very tired when doing Dracula not having speaking lines, or at times the lines were so bad, he's like, well, I don't even want to say them. I'd rather just do the film silent. I feel like he really enjoyed playing a character here that was very out of his usual dark, brooding self that he often got cast as. So I thought it was really nice to have him as an uptight, witty, urbane art critic.
Mm-hmm.
I think this particular segment had the best cast all round.
Oh, it's strong.
Oh,
Very strong.
Yeah. Yeah, what are you going to do? It's Christopher Lee.
Christopher Lee and Michael Gough, who's just showing up with that kind of shit-eating smile every time that he's...
Yeah, he definitely has that I want to punch you in the face.
You have to admit, though, that trick at the beginning, that's a great trick. Luring him into praising a piece of art and then showing it was a chimpanzee that did it. I think that's really hilarious.
Yeah.
And the chimpanzee did such a good painting.
Yeah, it was.
It was a fabulous painting. Maybe the chimp is just a talented artist. People spend millions of dollars on elephant paintings.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe Christopher Lee's character was just ahead of his time.
And honestly, Christopher Lee's character, I was sitting there, I was like, yep, you're that stereotypical person who's like, I'm going to come up with all this meaning out of this painting. I'm like, that's a bunch of bullshit.
I know we've discussed a loud, annoying asshole like the guy in the voodoo story. Now I'd like to turn our attention to our last story about a very stupid man who decides that if his wife was a sexy French vampire, he would rather kill her than to live with her. Now, out of all the passengers in the train car, is he the most deserving of his misfortune?
No,
Biff.
Biff, really?
Yes.
Oh my
Absolutely,
goodness.
100%.
This guy was an idiot. Biff was awful.
At least this guy, I think Dr. Carroll, didn't have a zebra couch.
Exactly.
True.
100%.
He did not. He has to think about it logically. If your wife was a vampire and she hasn't killed you yet, then just ask her if she's a vampire, and then you might be able to come to some understanding. But you don't need to take advice from somebody else, distrust her, and then just try to kill her? What?
So the thing with this story is after figuring out that it was Donald Sutherland's character that was going to be in the last one instead of Christopher Lee, I actually had a different thought for how this whole thing was going to turn out. And then I should have known better because I know how these anthologies work. I, in some ways, wanted this to end with Donald Sutherland's character being a vampire on the train and killing them all.
Oh.
That's nice.
And so I wanted it and I expected it, and I was very sad that it didn't happen because I just thought that would be really fun to be the last one to take the cards. Everyone else all had to end in death, and then it would have turned out that he was the death that was going to be killing. I just thought that would have been a really cool way of doing it.
I like it.
Yeah.
So I'm very sad that it didn't happen.
That said, Riley, I am completely with you. If my wife were a sexy French vampire and she hadn't killed me, I would just roll with it.
Yeah.
It didn't take a lot of convincing to convince him she was a vampire. No. That being said, it did lead you to believe that she was actually a vampire. He closed it saying there doesn't need to be 2 doctors or 2 vampires in town.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was correct that she was a vampire.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But that was hasty on his part. It's why I don't think that he was necessarily in the wrong, but people should take maybe 24 hours. Not the same day you take the stake.
One of the things, too, that he was probably thinking of is this little boy was dying, right?
Right.
And since he didn't know about Dr. Blake being a vampire, he probably was more concerned about his wife killing people.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not on the Santa Clara diet where we're all just like eating people and being okay with it. But I think that was probably just his initial reaction of how do I stop her from killing more kids or potentially killing a kid? And he was dumb because that's the only way he could think of.
Yeah, it circles back to that idea that all of these people accepted the supernatural. I just have to assume that in this little world they're living in, that supernatural just must be a more commonplace occurrence because they really were like, you think it's a vampire? Must be.
Well, if you think about how Dr. Terror went about opposing all of this potentiality was the fact that there is a natural side and a supernatural side. So I kind of think that, yes, he was probably really leaning into that in these worlds. The world itself is supernatural.
And that would make sense because, as you said, when he presents those potentials, there isn't any like, what the hell? You're telling me there's werewolves? It's, oh man, are you telling me that's going to happen to me? That's their concern.
Yeah, it's like nobody seems shocked that there are disembodied hands that move around, and much less werewolves and vampires.
While we're on the topic, what do we think about the framing story for this anthology film? It's very classic. You bring a couple of men into one room that don't know each other. Other films, sometimes it's just not even a person. It's sometimes like an artifact that they find that gets them into a story or a book that they read. And here we have Peter Cushing as Dr. Terror reading tarot cards to them. And then at the end, we have them dropped off from the train, which of course it is then revealed that they are already dead, or I think it was that the train crashed.
It's interesting, so I was thinking back to last year when we did Vault of Horror, and that uses a very similar, admittedly it was later, it was 8 years after this, so it probably cribbed from this, but it uses a similar framing device where all the characters turn out to be dead in the end.
I like this one better in that I think in the other one, they were just like shooting the shit, drinking around a table, which I was confused as to why they were brought together to begin with and who brought them together, or did they just somehow know each other? Whereas in this one, they're at least given something specific of, yeah, it makes sense that all these people are here. They're on a train going somewhere. That's just what the British people do.
Can attest to that being factual, yes.
We're talking about the scariest part of this film, the social anxiety of entering a full cabin and being like, I'm going to sit in the middle between you two and I don't know you, was terrifying. I don't tend to like framing elements that are, this is what's going to happen to you in the future. And then we flash back to the present situation, because I don't like it when they flash forward to the future and these stories that they're telling don't have the person being like, oh, I remember when Dr. Terrible told me this in the train car. This is a vine that's about to strangle me. And I know that that's illogical for the framework of a film, but I always struggle with, if they're being told the story now, they would know what's going on in the future.
I think what's funny here is that really, when you boil it all down, the story is death comes onto a train that is about to derail and cause at least the people in this car to die. And instead of just letting them die, he then toys with them and terrorizes them by telling them that their futures, which they don't have a future, could be potentially horrible because of these terrifying things. And I just find that kind of a dick move.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we have touched on each story. What do we think of the film as a whole? And what was your favorite story out of the 5?
Well, I can't help but compare this to the other two we've already done, The House That Dripped Blood and Vault of Horror. I thought this was a lot slower than those two, and to an extent less innovative. The 5 stories followed some pretty standard tropes. The ending of Vampire I thought was well done, with the town isn't big enough for 2 doctors or 2 vampires. That was a twist I wasn't expecting, so I appreciated that. But I think I really genuinely did enjoy The House That Dripped Blood a lot better. I do think my favourite story on this one was Disembodied Hand. Again, Michael Gough just following him around, just grinning maniacally as he fucks his life up. Beautiful, beautiful. And then the twist it then takes from there. That story just worked for me really, really well.
I thoroughly enjoyed, honestly, the second one, and I enjoyed the first movie. And especially as someone that doesn't come from like a background in horror or whatever, I was really surprised with how much I liked it. I actually really liked the ending of Dr. Terrible, which in my head I've been calling Dr. Horrible Sing-Along Blog the whole time. Sorry about it.
Yes.
I was really captivated by that ending of what do these death cards actually mean, and that Cushing was death the whole time. I thought it was a nice ending, and I need to watch more Christopher Lee horror movies. So good job.
That you should.
Yeah, I'm in.
As for comparing to some of the older ones, I tend to agree with Anthony. It's not necessarily the strongest, but seeming as it was one of the first ones, I'll give it some leniency. And a lot of things were taken from this into those other ones, and then they probably improved upon it. I think it's going to be pretty obvious. The most satisfying one for me was the third one, because Biff was the worst. But the most enjoyable one to watch was, yes, in fact, the disembodied hand, because watching Christopher Lee and Michael Gough just go back and forth against each other was wonderful to see.
I'm going to have to agree. I believe the disembodied hand is my favorite story out of the bunch. Before I go into more details about it, I also agree with Anthony. I've seen several horror anthology films, and maybe because it was the first one, it hadn't found its footing yet or what they wanted to do. I found it to be very mild. For example, the Creeping Vine story I felt was particularly poor. So the disembodied hand, though, quite enjoyable, and I really enjoy the levels of pettiness there. I think that is just excellent. I find that very amusing. I feel like that is something that is just so human, and that really just cracks me up. Well, from Dr. Shrek, that wraps us up. We've had Scottish werewolves, horrible landscaping, important tips for traveling to the Caribbean, ways to get even with your critics, and why you should always get a second opinion from another doctor. And that Ingrid Pitt is always looking to steal your lady. So, from all of us watchers in the fourth dimension, enjoy your spooky season. You have been listening to Watchers in the Fourth Dimension with Julie Philippek, Diana Birney, Anthony Williams, and myself, Riley Schreck. This bonus episode, He Also Double Tapped It, was recorded Wednesday, October 2nd, 2024. If this is your first time listening in, all of our previous episodes are available through your favorite podcasting app. You can interact with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Watchers4D. And you can email us at watchers4d@gmail.com. If you enjoyed the show, please do subscribe and leave us a review or rating on your favorite podcasting app. All of those things really help the show. And remember, this Halloween, make sure to taste the deadly passion of the blood nymphs, because yes, they are real, and yes, they are spooktacular.
Glug, 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 glug.